Today we are talking with Srinath Raghavan, the author of India's War, Second World War and the Making of the Modern South Asia. Welcome to Redara, and we are excited to hear more about the book and about you as well.
Great to be here.
Thank you. India's role in the Second World War is not very well known and it's mostly underplayed both in India and outside India. What brought you to the book exploring this subject, and what is the central theme or the focus of the book?
Well, I got interested in the subject partly because I spent 6 years in the Indian Army myself. Mm-hmm. And while in the Army, I served as an infantry officer in one of the oldest regiments of the Indian Army. And sort of even a cursory acquaintance with the history of my own regiment kind of alerted me to the fact that the regiment had fought in all kinds of places during the Second World War, places whose names were barely recognizable to me back then. And subsequently, when I left the Army and went on to sort of do academic military history further, this was a topic which remained at the back of my mind as something that I'd like to pursue going forward. So it's really a subject which has been with me for about 15 years. As for what are the major themes of the book, I think there are two sort of broad themes. The first is the story of what India did for the war, which is India's military, economic, and material contribution to the Second World War itself. And this, I think, is a story which, as you alluded to, isn't really very well recognized. In many ways, even though we sort of have always thought of the war as a world war, we are only now really coming to think of it as a global conflict, which pulled together various regions of the world into one overarching conflict. And in that sense, the story of South Asia has been neglected by historians of the World War. The other thing which I wanted to do was, and this sort of it concerns more the story about India itself, is about what the war did to India. Because much of our reading of Indian history in the decade around the Second World War primarily tends to airbrush the war out of the picture, more or less, because that's also the decade in 1947 is when India became independent of the British Empire. And the story is simply that of, the rise of Indian nationalism and the attainment of independence and so on. Whereas in the crucial final stages of India's march towards decolonization, the Second World War happened. And in many ways, the impact of the war has not been taken into account either by historians of India or in terms of popular understanding.
And of course, India changed forever after that, because the war had impact at the political level, at the economic level, industrial level, and also at the people level as well. It had a very vast and deep impact across all strata of the society.
You're absolutely right. In many ways, just to give you a small example, the fact that at the time of independence, India was also partitioned into the two new states of India and Pakistan would have been inconceivable but for the fact of the Second World War, because it was during the course of the Second World War that the party which campaigned for the creation of a separate state for the Muslims of South Asia, which is known as the Muslim League, really came into its own. And without understanding the political impact of the war, we really cannot come to understand why is it that India was partitioned. So even a simple but striking and historically so consequential a fact as a partition of India cannot be understood without taking into account the impact of the war.
So if you would explain to people who are not very well familiar with the topic and the history, how India got drawn into the Second World War, as we call the Axis War.
Well, India was part of the British Empire, and the British Raj had contributed to the maintenance of the empire all the way back from the late 19th century. Much of the British Empire in Asia and Africa had been conquered by the force of the Indian Army, which was the main sort of strategic reserve of military manpower for the British Empire. And India had fought in the First World War. So in a sense, it was more or less, it was a foregone conclusion that India would also take part in the Second World War. But what happened at the time when the war broke out in Europe, which is when the Viceroy of India, who was the sort of leading British official who was to sort of govern India, Lord Linlithgow, just announced that India was at war with the Axis powers, without so much as a note of discussion with any official, non-official, nationalist, loyalist, any shade of Indian opinion during that period. And that, I think, got India off into a kind of a troubled start, because what it did was that the politics of the war became quite confused. partly because many Indian parties were willing to support the British war effort against the sort of Axis powers. But at the same time, the fact that Britain was not even willing to consult India, and this is what, just about a decade before India becomes independent, and when nationalist opinion is pretty well formed, people's political consciousness has evolved considerably. So the Indian opinion took it pretty badly that way. So the war got off to a troublesome start, at least in political terms. But nevertheless, India was pulled in willy-nilly.
So what happened? How India contributed? Obviously, you go at a great length in explaining all that. But if you would give some examples of how India got drawn at economic level, in terms of the army that never existed to the length that it almost became almost one of the largest volunteer armies around the world. If you would explain how all that slowly started and began the process of India slowly getting drawn into the war effort as well, and other efforts as well.
Yeah, sure. So, in terms of the military contribution itself and about the role of the Indian Army, the Indian Army initially took part in the campaign against Italy in North Africa, then was very instrumental in sort of knocking the Italians out of the East African theater. Subsequently, the Indian Army was instrumental in occupying Iran, Iraq, and Syria. In fact, much of the areas that are today under the sort of control of the Islamic State, or where much of the Syrian conflict is being fought, was for the bulk of the Second World War period under the occupation of the Indian Army. And then once the Japanese attack on, Southeast Asia as well as the United States began, then India was pulled into the Southeast Asian theater. So the Indian Army sort of fought a campaign, was kicked out of Malaya, then had to withdraw from Burma, and then subsequently had to reorganize, prepare itself once again, and then delivered a hot blow to the Japanese in Burma. So that, in a nutshell, is really the range of places in which Indian Army fought campaigns, all the way from Hong Kong down to Southeast Asia, to the Middle East, to North Africa, to the Italian peninsula. So the Indian Army was sort of covered this entire very wide space. At the start of the war, in September 1939, the Indian Army was a small policing force, practically. I mean, much of its role really was to make sure that the Northwest Frontier Province, which is today in Pakistan, and where the tribes and others were sort of restive, had to be kept under control. Some amount of internal security orientation, riot control and such like things. So the Indian Army, which was just about 200,000 in number, was hardly prepared for anything like a modern industrial war, which is what it ended up fighting during the Second World War. So it meant that, the army had not only to expand, it went from 200,000 in 1939 to 2.5 million by 1945, a completely all-volunteer force, so as you mentioned, the largest volunteer force of all the armies during the Second World War, and also an army which had to undergo multiple transformations organizationally in order to adapt, equip, prepare, train to fight against various kinds of enemies. Just to give you a small example. When the Indian Army went into North Africa, the deserts of Egypt and Libya, to fight against the Italians, obviously you needed a mechanized army because it was a war which was going to be fought in the desert with tanks, with armored vehicles, with trucks, and so on. All of which were completely new and something that the Indian army and its soldiers had never seen or trained on. So you had to undergo a whole process of mechanization. But subsequently, by the time you come to 1943-44, when the focus shifts to taking an offensive into Burma to kick the Japanese out there, you had to more or less sort of go through a process of demechanization, because now you were fighting in jungles and mountains where all this mechanized stuff was of no good. So in a sense, Second World War was this, very interesting hybrid of a mechanized war, but also a war where very traditional forms of animal transport were used. In fact, the Indian Army fought in the Second World War using elephants, which was the last time in the 2,000-year history of the Indian subcontinent that elephants were ever used in warfare. So you see this very peculiar mix of very archaic forms as well as very modern forms of warfare coexisting, and the Indian Army had to adapt and evolve throughout this period.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. How did it impact the political parties and the nationalism sentiment that was slowly brewing, especially since the beginning of the Second World War? How did it really, in your opinion, or based on what you have found, did it really hastened or expanded the efforts to gain independence in 1947, or independence may have been delayed?
Let's look at it this way, right? So the Indian nationalist movement, in a sense of mass mobilization, especially of the Indian peasantry, which sort of began in the aftermath of the First World War. We'd already seen about 20 years of that between 1919 and say 1939, under the leadership of Gandhi, of the Congress Party, this sort of mass mobilization of Indian nationalism. So Indian nationalism was reasonably well advanced by the time the war broke out. But what the war did was that it brought into sort of open the many fissures between the Indian nationalist movement, its various components. So on the one hand, you had the Congress with, M.K. Gandhi, with Nehru and other sort of iconic leaders. But then you had a host of other leaders who also found an opportunity to assert their sort of requirements, because the British Raj, which is the government of India, had to, lean on the support of various kinds of groups, right? So for instance, Muslims were a major part of the Indian Army's recruitment. So, they had to sort of reach out to those parties which spoke, or at least claimed to speak, for the Muslims of India, and who demanded a separate state as the price for cooperation with the war effort. So in a sense, you had to give in. But at the same time, what it did was that it brought to fore, in a very concentrated period, all kinds of debates about the future of India, about what kind of a constitution we wanted to have, what should be the sort of role of politics, of how do we give security and rights to minorities. So everything, all the sort of political discussions that will become so central to the making of modern India really are crystallized during the Second World War. So in that sense, the war does accelerate many of the processes which have been sort of building up to a tempo, but then the war really gives them an additional impetus and gives a very different twist to the politics of India.
Yeah, those dormant latent forces just brought all in the front, and then they all collide within their own ways.
That's right.
Let's talk about two points, I think, which you have highlighted very well with the charts and graphs and tables and very fact-filled, data-rich book that you have there. If you would explain industrially how India's contribution was there, did it bring modern technology? Did it accelerate innovation? Did it bring certain things that would have not happened for years and years? Or did it also create a new industrial dynamic that was never there before?
Well, so at the outbreak of war, India was this very paradoxical economy, right? So it's overwhelmingly, very largely an agrarian economy, and a poor agrarian economy at that. But India also always had a small industrial sector, which was doing reasonably well even before the war began. But the problem was that, the British interest in terms of lending support to Indian business groups was always quite limited, because Britain always saw India as a major market for its own exports coming out of Britain. So you did not want to give too much of play for various kinds of industries to develop. For instance, Indian textile industries in the, say, 20 years before the war had, more or less, diversified into various kinds of markets. So the British did not want India to be producing various kinds of things, except for some basic consumer goods. But what the war did was two things. First was, because of the demands of supplying both equipment to the Indian Army as well as to the wider war effort, India had to start producing a lot more. The second was that things like importing machinery from the United Kingdom or even the United States became increasingly difficult as the war progressed, because shipping was at quite a premium, and Allied shipping always had other priorities than this kind of stuff for India. So in effect, India was put on this regimen where it had to bootstrap its industries and force them to ratchet up productivity in a very short period of time. And that gave a certain kind of boost to a planned model of Indian economic development, which would continue into the years of Indian independence as well. So to that extent, you can definitely say that the war was a trigger for rapid industrialization of India, though rapid did not necessarily mean either that it was balanced or that quality-wise it was very good, but it still left independent India with quite a solid industrial base with which to start off.
And, the war also gave a reason, or rather an outlet, for a lot of poor families and people who never had jobs or very mediocre jobs, and a way to get an employment. And as a result, that created some opportunities that was never available to the poor people before.
Well, that's very true. And again, the context before the war has to be kept in mind, because, the 1930s is the period of Great Depression, not just in the United States, but globally, and India, being an agriculture exporting economy, is very badly hit by the fact that farm prices have collapsed, just as they collapsed in the United States. And as a result, India was in pretty dire shape when war broke out. And the war effort, the fact that, so many people had to serve as soldiers, that you needed many more, hundreds of thousands, in fact, millions of people to sort of act as military labor in various ways, construction of airfields, provision of goods, to sort of, operating in dockyards, to doing various kinds of things. All of that meant that, there were sort of opportunities not just for employment, but some kind of social mobility as well. Because a lot of the people who took part in the war effort, especially in terms of, military labor for construction and other activities, came from traditionally very marginalized groups of Indian society. So, as Indian society, the main organizing principle has always been that of caste. And most of these groups came either from the bottommost sort of strata of the caste system as it operated in India, or in some cases, those even stood out of the caste system, right? So so-called untouchables, for instance. Mm-hmm. But all of these groups actually got an opportunity because of the war effort to sort of not just gain employment, but a degree of social mobility. So in that sense, war also had certain kinds of positive consequences for India.
Yeah, yeah. Now, the modern makeup of India is largely driven by, in many ways, it's very heavily influenced by Sikh community. What was the makeup then when the India went from 200,000 to 2.5 million? And the other question is, how good were these people, or how well or they adapted, or how quickly they improved the training and or mastery of some of this complex equipment at that time?
Yes. So the pre-war Indian Army, and for the longest period, used to be, recruited and raised on the basis of a theory which was known as the martial races theory. But the British basically had this idea that there were only some groups within India, many of which were minorities like the Sikhs, the Gurkhas, some sort of communities from northwest India, some parts of Muslims from the Punjab. And so a small set of communities were the ones who were held to be exclusively capable of bearing arms and acting as soldiers. So, it was a sort of a construct. It was really a theory with which they operated, known as the martial races theory. Now, what the war did really was to throw this entire theory out of the window. Not that the British gave it up, but that they were forced to. Because if you had to go from an army which is about 200,000, in number, to about 2.5 million, then there's just no way that you could depend only on this select small set of communities from which the British used to recruit the Indian Army. So you had many more communities from various other geographies of India, particularly the south of India, who got an opportunity to come in. Now, how good was the Indian soldier? I think it's a good question. And the honest answer would have to be that's not very good until quite late in the day. Because, and it's not just because of some innate quality, because there is no such thing as innately good or bad as soldiering. A soldier's quality depends primarily on training. And that proved to be the major deficit within the Indian Army, at least until 1944. Because, the expansion happened at such breakneck speed that there were very few experienced non-commissioned officers or officers within every unit who could train all the new people who were coming in. So as a consequence, the Indian Army really had to learn a very painful series of lessons from various defeats against the Germans in North Africa, against the Japanese in Malaya and in Burma. And, as I said, it was not until about 1944 that the Indian Army sort of got its entire mechanism for transmitting lessons learned on the battlefield back to training institutions, which would then train people and send them to the forward. So you have this sort of conveyor belt of knowledge being picked up from the front, being sent back to training schools, the people being trained in those schools who are then sent to the front, right? So that conveyor belt of expertise and training really got working smoothly only from about 1944, and which is also the period when the Indian Army really comes into its own against the Japanese.
Did the British invest in the mechanization? That's what we would call it at that time, because there was no electronics, there was no satellites, other things there. And what was the level of investment, and what kind of investment that was there, or it was just only as needed for their purposes?
Well, the British investment in the mechanization of the Indian Army was practically nothing, because there were hardly any sort of, mechanized vehicles, tanks, armored personal carriers, even sort of armored trucks, right? In which to move infantry. So all of which was practically non-existent. In fact, the mechanization of the Indian Army began in earnest only after the United States extended Lend-Lease to India, which happened in December 1941. Once the attack on Pearl Harbor happens, President Franklin Roosevelt decides that Lend-Lease will also be now applicable to India. So in effect, the Indian Army is equipped with American equipment, and that is what enables the mechanization of the Indian Army to happen. Unfortunately, the British had very little to do with it.
Now, what was that Lend-Lease? What were the terms, or what were the features of that?
Well, the Lend-Lease was a sort of a larger agreement which the United States had with all allies, especially Britain, which was to say that, Americans would sort of give equipment not on asking for terms of payment, but simply as, either being lent or leased, right? So there was this entire act which was constituted and passed. And Lend-Lease was then also extended to India. And that, as I said, was quite important because, one of the most underappreciated facets of the Second World War in India is the extraordinary involvement of the United States in India during the war. Because from about 1943, India becomes a major allied base for operations in Southeast Asia against the Japanese and for supporting the Chinese, the armies of Chiang Kai-shek, who was a major United States ally in Asia as well. So in a sense, India becomes central to the fighting in Asia. And the United States really comes in a big way. And the American involvement in the war was something that I, frankly, was very, very surprised to learn the extent of it, even as I was researching the book.
And even the British Army, Churchill had a lot of problems paying for the American support because I think at one point President had to threaten to confiscate some of the large ships in South Africa that were British ships because of the non-payment.
No, that's right. I mean, see, the British, as the story goes, practically bankrupted themselves during the Second World War. But the fact is that they were more than bankrupted because even a poor country like India ultimately ended up being a major creditor to Britain during the war because India was in real time supplying goods for supporting British armies, allied armies in not just India, but in Southeast Asia, in the Middle East, and North Africa, all of which was not paid for in real time by Britain at all. In fact, all of the payment for all of that was stretched out for about a 10-year period after the end of the war. So the British sort of financial power depleted very sharply during the war. And that's what allowed the United States then to come into India in a big way, because then the United States was the mainstay of equipping, sort of preparing India for the campaign against the Japanese.
So in many ways, the Indian Army was financed through the American investment or American capital. And
yeah, I mean, I'd say that not so much finance, but certainly equipped quite directly by American military equipment. And even other ways, right? I mean, if you look at just the scale of the military infrastructure development which had to happen in India, because, much of the fighting was eventually going to happen in Burma, because the Japanese, that's where the Japanese were. And Burma is very close to the easternmost end of India, right? And it's as far geographically as you can think from, say, the main ports like Calcutta or Bombay, all of which are, in different parts of the country. So you had to create this entire extraordinary chain of logistical sort of management to make sure that the armies which were sort of preparing to take on the Japanese in the eastern end of India could be supplied. So, for instance, the U.S. Army had 2 battalions of the U.S. Army Railroad practically took over a 750-mile stretch of the Bengal and Assam Railway, which is the easternmost link in India, and ran it for 2 years because the Americans just practically took it over, introduced all kinds of new practices of management, of turnaround times, how to sort of load equipment, bought in new techniques of inventory management, and made sure that the war effort was possible. So in a sense, the American sort of involvement was very real and tangible.
It also changed the thinking of how the war was fought by the Indians.
Yes, of course, it did. And then, again, the Americans also, the United States also had a politically very different view about India, because President Roosevelt, in fact, was very keen that Indian nationalists should be allowed by Churchill and the British leadership to actually come forward and contribute to the war effort. Of course, that did not happen, but President Roosevelt did lean quite heavily on Churchill, at least in 1942, to bring Indian nationalist opinion on board. And subsequently, the Americans were quite clear that as much as they were supporting the war effort which was operating out of India, they would want to see India become independent by the end of the war. So I think even politically, they were quite at odds with the British.
Now, looking at the post 1945 or post-Second World War and then post-independence, India had to fight another kind of war, one with its own brother, so to speak, which is Pakistan, and then obviously there was the creation of Bangladesh, and in between India had to endure a very humiliating defeat with its neighbor, which is a much larger economy and continues to dominate, which is China. Has the paradigm shifted that, real threat we have, so to speak, if there ever was, that is really more at the China-centric rather than dealing with the smaller skirmishes with Pakistan?
Well, I think if you look at from the vantage point of 2016, I'd say that most Indian military planners would regard the major challenge, potential challenge to Indian security as coming from China. I think there's no question about that. But where the story really links up with the Second World War is along these lines, which is to say that today the United States and other Asian countries want India to play a much larger role in the Asia-Pacific region and the Indian Ocean region, right? So we have this sort of newfangled term called Indo-Pacific, which is used to sort of say that, India has to be able to operate in this wide sphere. Now, the last time when India actually operated along that wide sphere, if you look back, was during the Second World War. Because that was the time when India was able to operate everywhere from the eastern coast of Africa through to the South China Seas, all the way up to Hong Kong. So, in a sense, one of the reasons for doing this book was also that, all history in some ways is contemporary history, right? I mean, we all write history or look at the past very much with certain contemporary lenses in front of our eyes. And for me, the fact was in researching and writing this book was also to try and recover that kind of a wider strategic role that India had, which in some ways we ourselves seem to have forgotten. But now, because of the pressure of events, we are being looked upon to come forward and play that kind of a role once again.
Yes. What are the lessons to be learned from this meticulous exercise and research that you have put together, which nobody has ever explored before? What is the Indian planners, the military planners, or political leaders can, or even the student of history can learn from this? Where India's role has been in the past, or where India probably strategically should focus or go further, or what are the threats that we should be worried about going forward?
First of all, I mean, history does not teach any straightforward lessons. So any claim to be sort of learning something from history and applying it to contemporary problems is always a bit fraught, right? In fact, one of my favorite historians, A.J.P. Taylor, used to say that the only thing you can learn from history is how to make new mistakes. Now, I wouldn't go so far, but I think the one lesson, quote unquote, which does stand out from this in researching and writing this book, was that if you look at India's ability to play the kind of wide role across the Indian Ocean region, the Middle East, through to Malaya, Southeast Asia, and so on, primarily happened because India, which was then undivided, of course, was nevertheless very closely, in many ways, economically, politically, strategically linked with the region around it, right? So India was very closely connected with Afghanistan, with the Persian Gulf countries, and on the other side with Burma, with Singapore, with Malaya, and so on. So in a sense, if we are really thinking about India once again playing this kind of a more expansive role across both Middle East and Asia Pacific, then we have to be able to recover some of these kind of strategic and economic linkages. Because what is happening today is that precisely because we have problematic frontiers both with Pakistan and with China, and because countries like Afghanistan and Burma have been sort of looking inward for several decades now because of a variety of problems, India has never been able to project its power outside its immediate borders. So in order to be able to play this kind of a wider role, I think one of the things that Indian policymakers will have to take much more seriously is the effort, which is currently underway, but still not in as strong terms as we should be seeing, of trying to economically and strategically integrate South Asia, the wider South Asian region, under India's leadership. And I think that really is the challenge for India. If we are able to do that, we will once again be in a position to project our power outside of the subcontinent. If we are not going to be able to do it, then I think any attempt by India to sort of play a wider Asian or a global role is bound to be limited, because our energies will be focused on the immediate subcontinental problems rather than outside it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Also, the preparedness, the military preparedness, or at the training level, at the equipment level, at the technological level, is that something that has been kind of internalized, and the proper investments that always needs to be made, which are always challenging, because we went through a pretty nasty Bofors scandal.
Yes, of course.
And
that's been a recurring sort of a problem for us. But again, I think you're seeing a lot of change there, especially in terms of India's relationship with the United States. Has really enabled us to make certain kinds of important military acquisitions of a kind that we desperately need. So as I see it, the fact that we once again have a strategic partnership with the United States, which we did not have for much of the 50 years of the Cold War, it once again enables India to acquire the necessary sort of elements of power, which it can then project in its own region. So I think once again the strategic relationship with the United States, which you had a preview in the Second World War, is something that we can now look forward to.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Now, coming back to the geopolitical situation and looking at from the backdrop of this history, in the Second World War, China was not that involved, at least directly against India. And if China is one of the strategic challenges that India, or one of the major strategic challenges that India faces now, or may have to face, and China has built up its manufacturing base, and most of the arms that China uses are made in China. But that is not the case with India, where India still is in acquisition mode, but actually not in the making mode. And that is one of the major weaknesses of Indian industrial and military infrastructure. Is there any effort being made on that now, or?
Yeah, well, I mean, you're absolutely right. In fact, during the Second World War, you could make an argument that India and China were more or less allies against the Japanese, because the Japanese had invaded China, and then subsequently, India was the base from which the Chinese armies were being supplied to fight against the Japanese, and so on. And then so in a sense, during the Second World War, you had India, the United States, and China sort of coming together in a military alliance to stave off the Japanese threat to Asia. And today, arguably, the situation is very different. It's India, Japan, and the United States, which in some ways seem to be coming together, at least in the maritime domain, to make sure that, China or any other country is not able to unilaterally dominate Asia Pacific. Coming back to your question about, India's industrial weaknesses and so on, I think it's absolutely right. I mean, it's not the case that India does not have a military industrial base of its own. It's just that military industrial base has never acquired the degree of sophistication that you need in order to be able to make and manufacture cutting-edge platforms. And to be fair, again, it's not as if the Chinese have been much better on that count. I mean, they too tend to import a lot of their military equipment, especially from the Russians. And in some ways, the Russians have given better equipment to India than they have to China. But nevertheless, the fact still remains that China's industrial lead means that it has an edge even in terms of manufacturing of military equipment over India. But as I see it, I mean, the way forward for India, and this is the way that the government seems to be looking at it as well, is that we need to be able to have critical sort of relationships with countries like the United States, which will then enable us to not just buy stuff off the shelf. So, for instance, India and the United States are today exploring various kinds of projects, of technology transfer to India, so that, you have a foreign direct investment by an American sort of manufacturer who sets up plant in India. So you transfer the know-how into India. The equipment is manufactured in India. It could be used by the Indian Army or the Indian Defense Forces, or even exported out of India, right? So all of that is in works now, and hopefully, it will sort of help redress at least some of the military imbalance that we have with China currently.
So that was all about book, but tell us a little bit more about the man who wrote the book and you. How did you get involved in the military and history? And of course, how did you join the, first of all, Indian military?
I'd say that, joining the Indian Army was something of an accident. Not to say that, I sort of accidentally ended up there, but it was not by design, certainly. Now, I sort of began by studying theoretical physics and mathematics. And at some point when I was nearing my graduation, it struck me that I was not really cut out for going and doing a PhD in the sciences. Because there are certain kinds of theoretical sciences where either you're really good or you're no good. You can be a middling historian, but there is no middling theoretical physicist. So it meant that, I really had to sort of abandon sciences and start doing something else. And I really didn't have much of a clue because most of my high school and college years were spent in very serious, intense pursuit of the sciences. But I had sort of done the ROTC equivalent in the Indian university system. So that then had given me some kind of inkling, a leg into the military sort of life. And given that a couple of my friends from college had ended up signing up to serve in the Indian Army as officers, I thought that may be a good thing to do. And I was 20 years old, and I signed up, served for 6 years, and then left. And by the time I left, I knew that, what I really wanted to do was military history. So I left the Indian Army and then went to London to study further.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And what fascinated you about history, and how did you get into writing? Because writing is something that you cannot do unless you like to write.
Yes, that's true. And so one of the things about even the sciences for me was always, for instance, I really got interested in sort of astrophysics and theoretical physics because of the extraordinary high quality of science writing by very top scientists, right? I mean, so even today it strikes me, even though now I'd see very much myself in the history and social sciences camp, that, top flight scientists in some ways can convey their ideas to an intelligible, serious reading public much better than most historians can. So to me, the idea of conveying serious research and taking it to a much wider readership was always an underlying motivation for research. And, even had I stayed on in the sciences, I'd imagine I'd have written at least books would have been accessible to a intelligent lay readership, not just a scientific audience. So to that extent, I was very interested in writing. And history is a discipline, which sort of lends itself to it because you're not just telling stories, but you're also using those stories to explain historical change over a period of time, and doing it in a way that built on serious, rigorous research, but also was made accessible to a reading public was something that I very much look forward to.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Now, you've written several books, more than almost 5 books, and the topics have been very related to India or India's security or India's military or India's road to independence. They all have some weaving themes. Are you working on any other book, or you think there are other topics that you would like to explore in the near future as well, additional topics?
Well, I'm actually writing a book currently for my same publishers who published this book, Basic, which is going to be looking at the United States' involvement in South Asia, by which I mean India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Burma, from about the late 19th century to almost the present. And that's the next book that I'm currently working on.
Oh, very nice. And when is it likely to be finished?
Well, I'm sort of due to hand in the manuscript by I think mid-October or so. So it's pretty well advanced even as we're speaking, and hopefully it'll see publication not very long after.
And hopefully we will have an opportunity to talk to you again when the book is published and explain our readers or listeners what the book entails.
I'd very much like to do that.
We have been speaking with Srinath Raghavan, India's War, World War II, and the making of modern South Asia. Thank you very much for your time and your comments, and it was enjoyable and very learning experience for understanding India's role in the Second World War.
Thank you so much for having me on your program. It is fantastic.
You're welcome. Thank you.